Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be discussing the design history and some of the design issues of the Sisters of Battle faction in the game of Warhammer 40,000. And to clarify, the focus of this video will be on the role of the Sisters of Battle faction within the specifically tabletop version of Warhammer 40,000, as obviously the game has been translated into a lot of different medium at this point. Ultimately, this isn't really about critiquing Sisters of Battle as a concept, because honestly I kind of love the army and how unbelievably crazy they are. I mean, look at this face. There is absolutely nothing going through that head except a hymn to the Emperor. And if we're being honest, an unreasonable number of war crimes, but that's neither here nor there. On top of that, as we'll see in this video, the Sisters of Battle have had some consistently strong lore and theming for their models to go along with them. They just haven't always had the rule set to accompany that theming and lore. But of course, let's kick this examination off by a great piece of trivia. The Sisters of Battle currently hold the record of having the longest time period between codexes while still being legal during that time period. The Sisters of Battle at one point went 17 years without a legal codex, at least one in physical print, where they had to basically rely entirely on either indexes or PDFs on the Games Workshop website. But ever since their introduction in 2nd edition, the Sisters of Battle have always been a legal army to field, even if the nature of fielding them was somewhat dubious at times. Now, as a small clarification before we move forward, I will actually be using the publication date listed on the various codexes. I know that publication date versus release date, especially when you start talking about releasing model ranges, may not necessarily align one for one, so there may be about a year or so of wiggle room, but close enough for government work. Now, before we get started with the examination proper, it's important to realize that during the very early Rogue Trader era, Games Workshop experimented with a lot of ideas. They were basically just throwing things at the wall, and not all of them fully stuck. Things such as the good old-fashioned robot phase didn't really end up making the cut later on down the line. So while there were some concepts that could be viewed as Sisters of Battle during the Rogue Trader era and before their proper codex, they're not really worth visiting, as they were little more than one-offs and didn't have any major lore to support them. This neatly brings us into our first introduction to the Sisters of Battle proper and their very first codex, Codex Sisters of Battle, published in 1997. So this codex is probably older than quite a few people watching this video. And despite this being the first major appearance of Sisters of Battle, we're not going to spend as much time on this specific codex as we are on one later one, and the reason is actually pretty straightforward and is in the Army List selection guidelines. Under using the Army List, it says, and I quote, "Unlike other army lists such as Ultramarines or Orcs, the Adeptus Ministorum army list is mainly intended to provide a source of allies for Imperial Guard, Space Marines, and other Imperial agents. The Adeptus Ministorum can be used as a complete army in its own right, but you will find it lacks certain elements such as support and heavy weapons. While it's possible to fight a straight battle with this army, it is far better suited for use in campaigns and special scenarios." So what that essentially boils down to is that the Sisters of Battle in 2nd edition were basically like the Imperial agents are today, less a cohesive army and more a loose collection of units held together by duct tape and string. And this is on full display when you see this wonderful two-page fold-out showing you essentially everything in the Sisters of Battle. You have 2 different vehicles, you have 2 different types of units, and you have some assorted characters, and that is essentially the entire army, plus or minus 1 or 2 things here or there. On top of that, you may have also picked up on something interesting within that quote, in that it is referred to as the Adeptus Ministorum army list. The Ecclesiarchy and the Sisters of Battle have somewhat of an odd relationship, because the Sisters of Battle are the face and the militant arm of the Ecclesiarchy, and tend to be the most common unit in basically all of the times the Ecclesiarchy has appeared on the tabletop, but they often get lumped together or sometimes even kind of separate elements in the game, as we'll see as we go into further codexes. Now, the lore in Codex Sisters of Battle feels very quaint by modern standards. If you've ever read or even come across some of the lore for modern Sisters of Battle, you probably know everything that's in this book. It's basically establishing the baseline for what would later become the Sisters of Battle lore. It's a lot like going back and watching Batman's origin story for the 15th time. You already basically know the notes if you're even remotely familiar with the character. It's also remarkably bare bones in certain areas, as the quote implied, it is very much focused on the Ministerial Storm as a whole and not necessarily Sisters of Battle, so a lot of the lore space is devoted to things like Gog Vandir, Sebastian Thor, and all of that mess. While the matriarchs, the 6 important figures of the Sisters of Battle, do make one appearance, only 2 of them are actually named in this book, Dominica and Catherine. The rest of the matriarchs, despite having orders basically formed around their example, are not actually named in this particular tome. Now, as a bit of a digression, going back and reading this book left me somewhat nostalgic for how grimdark 40k used to actually be. There's a small vignette that takes up about a third of a page called The Purge of Lastrati, and in this little vignette it describes a planet being taken over by religious zealots that work the population to death and basically turn a planet with a population of 14 billion into a population of only about 2.5 million. And this absolutely horrific genocide is so unremarkable in the 40k universe that the individuals responsible don't even get a name. It only names the order, it doesn't name any major figureheads. This is basically an irrelevant event within the 40k universe. There was no involvement of Xenos, there was no involvement of Chaos. The 41st Millennium and the Imperium in general are just an awful place to live in. I can't help but feel that reading this old vignette that if a story like this had been translated into modern 40k lore, it would turn out that Tzeentch was behind it the whole time, and it would end anticlimactically with Magnus the Red and Rabaut Guilliman throwing hands in a Waffle House parking lot until the police arrived. Trying to have an epic story, but centering the whole thing around a handful of idiot brothers that constantly lose each other, find each other, and fight each other, feels less like a large epic universe and more like a family trip to Walmart at 2 a.m. gone wrong. But I digress. The model range for Sisters of Battle in this very first codex is essentially just a collection of metal models, or in the case of the Immolator, metal add-ons to an existing plastic Rhino kit, and nothing really that notable. There's only a handful of Sisters of Battle poses, and that's because the units at the time were significantly smaller. There's also some named characters and even some supporting units that don't get models at all, and as far as I can tell never got models, but ultimately were deleted in future codexes, so not really worth dwelling on. As an interesting side note, while the Sisters of Battle weapons in this codex are mostly limited to bolters, flamers, and meltas, it's never really codified as the Holy Trinity at this point. It seems to just be the types of weapons they preferred using without any real annotations. Now, a key and big aspect of Sisters of Battle that modern players will be very fully aware of are the Acts of Faith, and the Acts of Faith have been such an iconic part of Sisters of Battle lore that most people would struggle to imagine a time when they didn't have it. Well, imagine no more, because in the 2nd edition codex there were no Acts of Faith. The closest you really have are Sacred Rites, but Sacred Rites are just so fundamentally different, they're not really that analogous. While this page does have a decent amount of text, what it ultimately boils down to is each of your units can roll on the Sacred Rites table at the beginning of the game, and you get that benefit for the rest of the game, and you get bonuses based on what types of models you have in your unit, such as Sister Superiors or Canonesses. This will also be a fun bit of nostalgia for the really old school players, because in Rogue Trader and even to a large extent 2nd edition, 40k was very much roll on a table the game, and Sacred Rites is no different from that. In fact, there are actually a lot of different tables in this book, especially ones for the Immolator, in which there are 2 separate tables that you roll on, one to see when you catch people on fire and one to see what you do when they're on fire. The Sacred Rites also demonstrates one of the other things that old school 40k used to love to do, and that is to have you track individual status for individual models. One of them basically gives you a 4+ save to shrug off psychic powers for every individual model in the unit that has to be rolled for individually, and you have to track who failed and who is affected by a psychic power. Honestly, stuff like this, while amusing, is actually just a lot of unnecessary bookkeeping, and it's easy to see why it was removed. Sacred Rites would briefly make an appearance later, although is a pretty far cry from an iconic aspect of the Sisters of Battle army, so we're not really going to be discussing it any further. While Codex Sisters of Battle on the whole is not very robust, there is a lot to unpack with the original Battle Sister squad, because it is wildly different in several areas than the ones that we have seen in later iterations. For starters, and one of the things that would occur very quickly to anybody looking at the stat line, is that a Battle Sister squad used to be both Ballistic Skill 4 and Toughness 4. Now, if you compare a Battle Sister to a Chaos Space Marine, the only difference between the Battle Sister and the Chaos Space Marine, at least in terms of raw stats, is that the Battle Sister is -1 Strength and -1 Weapon Skill. So they are basically Space Marines that aren't as good in hand-to-hand. They had the same toughness as Space Marines in 2nd edition. This would mark Battle Sisters out as one of the more elite armies, and this is supported by their unit composition, which only consists of 5 models, and then you can optionally add a heavy weapon or a special weapon, and obviously you can also attach things like characters. So the basic Battle Sisters squad with a heavy or special weapon was only 6 deep, marking it as basically a Space Marine analogous army. This stat line, where the Sisters of Battle are essentially just Space Marines that can't fight in hand-to-hand, would ultimately go away and never really came back. In fact, Sisters of Battle actually lost a lot of their stats when transitioning from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, and it is just kind of interesting academically to go back and look at these Sisters of Battle as they were originally envisioned, as essentially just Space Marines that can't fight in hand-to-hand. And shifting our focus a little to the Canoness entry, you'll notice the Canoness was originally Toughness 5, which just cements the idea that the Sisters of Battle were originally envisioned as demi-Space Marines. Another kind of interesting quirk when looking at the Canoness entry in 2nd edition is not only that it had a jump pack, which is kind of funny given that the jump pack was removed and then later added back, but also that the Canoness could have a bodyguard of Seraphim, but Seraphim were not necessarily jump pack sisters. Later on, Seraphim would be codified as sisters that use jump packs, but in this edition, Seraphim are just elite Sisters of Battle. That would get switched over to a different name later, but it is kind of an interesting side note. Now, ultimately, while this is not relevant to future codexes, I do want to draw your attention to the awesome Frateris Militia Band, which can be equipped on horses and can also take slings at a half a point per model, because of course they can. This unit wasn't really expanded upon in any future codexes, and as far as I'm aware, they never received models. They're just basically the Sisters of Battle conscript type units, but it is kind of funny looking back on it. All in all, this army list is exceedingly sparse even by 2nd edition standards, so there's not a lot of big conclusions to draw. It's basically the bare bones of what would become the Sisters of Battle later in terms of lore, models, and rules. In that respect, while the 2nd edition Codex Sisters of Battle is academically interesting, it doesn't really offer us that much insight into how the army has evolved in terms of modern 40k, other than just showing us where it originally started. That being said, it is worth taking a brief side trip into another aspect of the transition from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, because before Sisters of Battle got their next proper codex, they would get a minor rules update. 3rd edition was so different from 2nd edition that they actually had indexes giving all of the armies basically simplified rules, which is not exactly a revolutionary idea, but this did actually dramatically change the Sisters of Battle as a unit. Sisters of Battle went from basically Space Marines that couldn't fight in melee to just guardsmen with power armor and bolters. Weapon skill, ballistic skill were both dropped down to 3, as were strength and toughness. And this is largely where Sisters of Battle have stayed since. The single biggest nerf to the Sisters of Battle stat line didn't occur in a major codex, it occurred in an index in the back of a rulebook. In the grand history of the Sisters of Battle in Warhammer 40,000, the 2nd edition codex is essentially The Hobbit. It's a precursor to things to come, not bad for what it is, but ultimately relatively short and insubstantial. The real Lord of the Rings of the Sisters of Battle, however, would come in 2022 with the release of Codex Witch Hunters. Codex Witch Hunters was actually the second part in a trilogy covering the various orders of the Inquisition. The first part was Codex Demon Hunters covering Ordo Malleus with units like Grey Knights. The second one was obviously Codex Witch Hunters covering Ordo Hereticus with the Adeptus Sororitas, and the third codex was Codex Internal Problems at Games Workshop HQ. For some reason, the Codex Xenos Hunters or Alien Hunters covering Ordo Xenos, whatever it was supposed to be called, that was supposed to include Adeptus Arbites and Deathwatch, never really happened, and I don't think anybody has ever found a good reason as to why it didn't happen, but that's another piece of Games Workshop lore for another video. Ultimately, Deathwatch would get their own codex after only about 10 years, and the Adeptus Arbites would return to the 40k tabletop after only about 20 years, so all's well that ends well, I guess? While the lore of Codex Witch Hunters isn't that much more elaborate than Codex Sisters of Battle in terms of the Ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Ministorum, it does much more closely align the Ecclesiarchy and the Sisters of Battle with the forces of the Inquisition, and specifically Ordo Hereticus, which is a link that has continued to this day. Additionally, Codex Witch Hunters is the first major appearance of the Holy Trinity of Bolter, Flamer, and Melta, and this is where we have to get into 3rd edition codex design for a few different reasons. So in 3rd edition, the Imperium Imperium was supposed to have stagnated in terms of technology, so Games Workshop didn't like introducing things that weren't already there. So when they were looking for special weapons, heavy weapons, or vehicle classes to add to a given faction, they would look at existing stuff and try to pull from that. So when they looked at an Assault Bolter, which the Sisters of Battle didn't currently have in the previous codex, all they had was a Flamer and a Meltagun as their assault weapon. The only real option was the Storm Bolter, so that became the Assault Bolter essentially, that is still used by Sisters of Battle to this day. For the heavy weapons, the Sisters of Battle already had a Heavy Bolter, a Multi-Melta, and a Heavy Flamer, so they didn't really need anything fleshed out in that area. For the pistols, however, while the Sisters of Battle did technically have hand flamers, at least available on the Seraphim, and they also had bolt pistols, they didn't actually have a Melta pistol, so the writers at Games Workshop looked for any other weapon in the Imperium arsenal that might fill this role and found that Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, had a weapon called an Inferno pistol that was basically a Melta pistol. And that's why the Inferno pistol's name makes zero sense, because it's not actually supposed to be a Melta pistol, but they kind of had it fill that role. Codex Witch Hunters also marks the first appearance of the Combi Bolter Stake Thrower, which would later be known as the Condemner Bolt Gun. The idea of Sisters of Battle having a specialized stake thrower as an anti-psychic weapon basically came up exclusively in this codex, and Sisters of Battle being heavily anti-psyker focused in general also originated here, although the second edition did have some vague references to it. It always felt weird that the Contemner Bolt Gun and the stake thrower were part of the Sisters of Battle arsenal rather than the Ordo Hereticus arsenal for the Inquisitors. I suppose a lot of this kind of stemmed from the Ordo Hereticus having a very distinct Van Helsing-like feel with their models, and obviously the much newer Greyfax model carries on a lot of those features, but ultimately it really felt like the Bolter Stake Thrower was something that was part of Ordo Hereticus, the Inquisition aspect, and just got kind of lumped in with Sisters of Battle over time, but that's just my take on it. Codex Witch Hunters also brings us our first iteration ever of an Axe of Faith system within a Sisters of Battle army in Warhammer 40,000, and it is a bit of a mess. The Axe of Faith system basically involves your army starting out with a number of faith points equal to the number of faithful characters or units. You gain faith points when models are destroyed that are faithful, and you also spend faith points to use Acts of Faith. When you use an Act of Faith, you have to roll a 2d6 and compare it to the unit size. You might foolishly think you always have to roll over or under, but that would be wrong, as it varies based on which Act of Faith you're using. Each Act of Faith also has specific phases in which you have to use them. If you're thinking this sounds a lot like stratagems but with more steps, you're not entirely wrong. However, this is 3rd edition. The idea of stratagems was completely unheard of, and some of the effects are actually pretty ridiculous, up to and including the one that just gives an entire unit an invulnerable save equal to its armor save. Ultimately, the real problem with this Act of Faith system is that there are too many Acts of Faith that are too different. The timing on when you use them is all different, whether or not you have to roll over or under the unit size is different, and it's basically impossible for an opponent that isn't intimately familiar with Sisters of Battle to even know how many faith points you should have at any time. Ultimately, the biggest problem is that much like a lot of these types of systems, if a system isn't commonly used by other armies, it needs to be simple, and it can only really be this complex if it's used by multiple armies. But nothing else used or interacted with this Acts of Faith system, so it meant that Sisters of Battle players at the time could kind of just make up whatever they wanted, and their opponent would have trouble calling them out because there's about 5 paragraphs to read before you even get to the Acts of Faith themselves. It really is the kind of system that probably could have been a lot better had it simply been pruned down or simplified to simply a command check or something to that effect, rather than having a bunch of different conditions on how to use it, and in addition where most things didn't just get situational buffs whenever they needed it. In the current edition of 40k, something like this wouldn't feel completely out of place because yet again it just does a lot of things that you would do as stratagems now, but at the time the system was completely bonkers and ludicrously overcomplicated for a system that exactly one army used. This also brings up another interesting point in that the Acts of Faith system made the Sisters of Battle somewhat xenophobic against their own codex. You need faithful models, which were generally only Sororitas, and your Adeptus Sororitas units couldn't have non-faithful units in them to use Acts of Faith. So by taking things like vehicles or the Inquisition elements, or even some of the other Ecclesiarchy elements that didn't have the Acts of Faith rule, you were just kind of handicapping yourself by reducing the total faith pool that you could draw on at any given time. Generally speaking, the system did heavily incentivize basically ignoring about half of the codex, which was a bit of an issue, and we will see some issues later down the line with other codexes doing similar things. Now, as an interesting side note, if you do want a short and sweet crash course on roughly how this system works, you could download Dawn of War Soulstorm from Steam. The Dawn of War games in general are just great, but the Dawn of War games also came out at the same time as 3rd edition, so the Sisters of Battle in Dawn of War Soulstorm use a active faith system that isn't crazy dissimilar from the one in the 3rd edition codex. Obviously, because that is a real-time strategy, it does make some liberties, but on the whole, it is a very similar system and a very similar feel. For newer fans of 40k, you might not remember the Halcyon days prior to 8th edition, however, I'm sure the old-timers will remember the good old-fashioned force organization chart. This had a bunch of different types of units, such as HQ, troops, fast attack, heavy support, and elites, and an army would have to have a minimum number of some types of units and could only have a maximum number of other types of units. So ultimately, every army within 3rd edition was built within these constraints, and Sisters of Battle likewise had to be built within these constraints. However, Games Workshop didn't want to release an entirely new model line with a bunch of different models to cover all of these areas. So what they decided to do was to use the existing model line with only some minor modifications of adding things like the Stormbolter Gunner to try and fill out a bunch of different categories. The end result of this was that you got Battle Sisters, Elite Battle Sisters, Fast Battle Sisters, and Slow Battle Sisters, and all 4 of these units used the exact same models. Starting off with the regular Battle Sisters, and the first most notable feature is obviously they did lose the Toughness 4 from 2nd edition, but they did ultimately get their ballistic skill back up to a 4 from the 3rd edition index, so they at least have that going for them. They're not exclusively guardsmen with bolters and power armor, they're just kind of guardsmen with bolters and power armor. That being said, there is also another interesting tweak in that in the original 2nd edition codex you could only have 5 sisters per squad plus 1 heavier special weapon, but now your squads can go all the way up to 20 models deep. So Sisters of Battle could be fielded in large hordes, and the army actually goes back and forth several times throughout its history on whether or not the Sisters of Battle squads are capped at 10 or 20 models. It's like the designers just couldn't ever really figure out if they wanted Sisters of Battle to be an elite army or a chaff horde army. For the elite Sisters of Battle, instead of being named Seraphim, they are now named Celestines, and these are essentially Sisters of Battle on foot. As an interesting side note for later, this is the reason why the Celestine Sacrosancts are called Celestine Sacrosancts instead of just Celestines, to differentiate them from the bolter-wielding unit. Hilariously enough, the bolter-wielding Celestines and the Sacrosancts with the maces and shields only overlap for 1 codex, so it was a bit of a futile effort, but hilarious nonetheless. The Celestines ultimately featured the same weapon options as the basic Battle Sister squad, so no significant change in terms of firepower. However, in order to facilitate their role as a bodyguard for your characters, they had a special rule to always hit on a 3+ in close combat with their 1 attack at strength 3. Needless to say, this unit was not terrifically popular. For the Fast Battle Sisters, you got the Dominions, which actually have basically the same unit composition as they do now, with up to 4 special weapons, and the special weapons being basically identical in name, even if the rules have changed since then. What's interesting is when the developers were trying to think of a reason as to why they should be fast, the only thing they could come up with is that the unit rides in a transport, so they have a mandatory rule in which they must buy a transport, which I find is absolutely hilarious. The Heavy Sisters, the Retributors, basically the same name as they have now, and honestly the same squad comp with up to 4 heavy weapons with the same types of heavy weapons, again, even if the rules have changed, had no special rules at this point, although this was pretty par for the course for a heavy weapon unit in 3rd edition. Interestingly enough, outside of some of the options that you can equip to the Sister Superior, not a single weapon option or other upgrade has changed since this edition. You had what was then called an Imagifier, but it was currently called a Simulacrum Imperialis, basically does the same thing. It's essentially a pseudo banner for the unit. You have the same selection of heavy weapons and special weapons, and essentially the same numbers as well. You also had a feature that at the time was a rather unique one for the basic Battle Sisters to swap out their heavy weapon for a second special weapon, which is kind of interesting. They do retain that feature today, although more and more units do kind of have options like that right now, but at the time it was a little weird and a little unusual and gave them a nice bit of flavor. The codex was also accompanied by a new plastic kit that could built either the Rhino or the Immolator and was fully plastic, which was pretty nice, and in my opinion this is one of the better looking vehicles Sisters of Battle have ever gotten, because it has just the right mix of a vehicle that could function normally but is also a little bit more elaborate than it maybe needs to be. It strikes that good balance of something that is a little too ornate but not so ornate that it looks completely ridiculous that I feel like some of the newer vehicles kind of lack. It's also noteworthy that this was the first version of the Immolator kit that ever got the option to swap out its heavy flamers for either heavy bolters or multi-meltas, again kind of going along with that Holy Trinity theme, and this is a tradition that has continued even onto the current Immolator kit. Interestingly, the Immolator did actually feature the ability to move the full 12 inches and fire its heavy flamers, which was a pretty unique ability at the time as normal vehicles could only move 6 inches and fire their weapons. So it's a cool feature, but it wasn't really game breaking given that heavy flamers at the time were not exactly powerhouses. Codex Witch Hunters also featured a very interesting first. At the time, the now defunct Forge World was basically a specialty model line that had a few random and interesting items, but nothing that you could generally use for a normal game. They were basically novelties that you could just use for a one-off with your friend. However, in Codex Witch Hunters, for the very first time, they brought a Forge World model into the main game of Warhammer 40k. And considering that this was 2002, this was actually well ahead of the power curve, and it would be quite a few years before this happened with any other vehicle. The vehicle in question was obviously none other than the Exorcist, or the Exorcist? As you can probably tell, the transition from a Forge World model to a model in Codex Witch Hunters brought about some pretty significant changes to this particular model. Funnily enough, when they did an Imperial Armor book after this codex was released, they actually put in canon that both of these were Exorcists and both of these were canon models. The model that is in the Witch Hunters Codex is the Prioris model, and the model that was a Forge World kit is the Sanctorum model. Now, the Sanctorum model has been out of print for about 20 years, and that was really the last time it was ever referenced, so it's entirely possible it is no longer canon, but I do find it pretty funny that Games Workshop looked at both of these two models and said, yes, these are the exact same things both mechanically and aesthetically for at least a few editions. And for any of those 40k players who may be new to the game, don't be confused in thinking that the new Exorcist was a plastic kit. It absolutely was not. It was a basic plastic Rhino kit, but there were a ton of metal pieces on it that had giant gaps that had to be filled. In fact, there was so much metal on this model that if you were losing a game, you could simply chuck it at your opponent's forehead and try to get the judge to DQ your opponent for slow playing while they were unconscious on the ground. If you dropped this model on the floor, you would unironically have to check to make sure you hadn't damaged the floor. And while we're on the subject of new vehicles that were also annoying to put together metal kits, we have the Sisters of Battle Penitent Engine making its appearance for the very first time in the game. The Penitent Engine at this point was a single vehicle that operated on its own and was noticeably larger in terms of the model size than the current Penitent Engines. However, despite those differences, both the lore and gameplay of the Penitent Engines were generally pretty similar. It was an annoying vehicle to deal with that you would just plow into your enemy's lines and let them cause havoc until your opponent finally got around to killing it, or if they didn't get around to killing it, it would eventually kill them. Honestly, the Penitent Engines, despite changing aesthetically, haven't changed that much functionally over the years. But wait, there's more. The hits don't stop coming. Codex Witch Hunters also added two other metal kits that are not vehicles but are still pretty iconic to Sisters of Battle as they exist today, the Arco-Flagellants and the Sisters Repentia. Now, if I'm being completely honest, it did feel a little weird to get two separate units in the same codex that were melee-centric and had no armor. However, they were pretty different in terms of function. The Sisters Repentia hit harder, the Arco-Flagellants made more attacks, the Arcos were also generally more durable. What's interesting is that these two units haven't really changed that much from the time of inception to today. However, how they fit within the army list has changed pretty dramatically depending on which codex you look at. The big thing is that the Sisters Repentia, as they were initially released, were basically useless because the Eviscerators always struck last and they were toughness 3 with 1 wound. So generally speaking, that unit would just get rolled before they even attacked most of the time. One other rather interesting aspect is that the Mistress for the Sisters Repentia, Games Workshop often goes back and forth on whether it is an integral part of the unit or a separate character that you have to attach to the unit, and it really feels like they should just keep it as an integral part of the unit, given that every time they have made it as a separate character, it has essentially only ever buffed the Repentia and was basically mandatory for the Repentia. It is a pretty interesting design space, and it did add some much needed melee punch to the Sisters of Battle to round out some of their short range guns. Funnily enough, at the time, one thing that made both of these units incredibly hard to use was that neither of them could ride in transports. This was a holdover in 3rd edition that they did with a lot of melee units, in that they made it more difficult for them to ride in transports or made it impossible in some cases. It was something of a weird feature, and honestly I'm kind of glad it's gone. It was really dumb and annoying. With all that being said, however, both of these have become mainstays to the Sisters of Battle Codex, and it would be hard to imagine a new codex coming out without Repentia or Arcos being in it. Codex Witch Hunters also featured another unit that wasn't ever quite as iconic, but was attached to Sisters of Battle for quite some time, and that are the Death Cult Assassins. The Death Cult Assassins operated in relatively small units and were yet again another melee unit that essentially had no armor. It was an interesting concept, but ultimately never really proved to be quite as popular as the other Sisters of Battle melee options, and were removed from Sisters of Battle with the most recent codex. Codex Witch Hunters also brought us the very first appearance of the fan favorite character, Saint Celestine of the Living Saint. Saint Celestine at the time actually had a rather interesting rule because she could effectively resurrect an unlimited number of times, but only came back at random and would always deep strike back in instead of coming back near her last lone location. Additionally, she only came back with 1 wound, so in practice this was less divine intervention and more of an angel-themed game of whack-a-mole, but it could be really annoying if she came back on the last turn and just deep struck onto an objective and you lost the game because of it. Codex Witch Hunters also featured the very first appearance of the fan favorite Inquisitor Karamazov, otherwise known as Sir Not Appearing in Any Other Codex. In fairness, it was at least a pretty cool model and an interesting idea, although it was never very popular, and this also brings up the Inquisition aspect of the Sisters of Battle Codex, as there actually is a decent amount of space devoted to things like retinues, assassins, the Inquisitors themselves, and also transports and inquisitorial stormtroopers. You even have things like land raiders in the Sisters of Battle Codex, although as I said at the beginning, when you start looking at things like Act of Faith, there wasn't a lot of incentive to take things that were not Adeptus Sororitas or faithful units, so a lot of these units basically got ignored in favor of simply taking Adeptus Sororitas or things that supported the Adeptus Sororitas. Hopefully at this point the viewers can understand why I decided to spend so much time on Codex Witch Hunters. It established a lot in terms of the different units, the canon, and even the overall aesthetic that you could expect from Sisters of Battle vehicles going forward. It was probably the most important codex that Sisters of Battle have ever had in terms of establishing the overall tone for the army, and many things that are simply taken as read as being part of Sisters of Battle now were actually pretty revolutionary and a very interesting concept when they first released with Codex Witch Hunters. Undeniably, while the 2nd edition codex was the bare bones of what you could reasonably expect, Codex Witch Hunters really fleshed Sisters of Battle out into a much more cohesive faction, at least aesthetically and rules-wise. That being said, Games Workshop not wanting to release anything so harrowing as a line of plastic sisters or a large array of metal kits to fill out a bunch of different roles, did leave the army with some fairly interesting holes in terms of their capabilities, and while the Holy Trinity of Bolter, Flamer, Melta was a cool concept, it did leave the army lacking in several key areas, with the Exorcist being the only long-range fire support. Additionally, the various Inquisition elements within the Codex simply had too much anti-synergy with the way Adeptus Sororitas wanted to play, and often ended up getting left by the wayside, even though some aspects of it could have potentially been somewhat useful. While Codex Witch Hunters, I would say, was a very successful codex in establishing the Sisters of Battle, it also established some of their harsher limitations as well. Now, some of the astute viewers at this point are going to be looking at the timestamp on the video and thinking, we're only up to 2002, this is gonna take forever. But remember what I said in the very beginning, there is a massive jump between viable Sisters of Battle codexes, and it starts with Codex Witch Hunters. The next Sisters of Battle codex will not be for another 17 years. So while the 17-year long gap can be covered pretty quickly, the codexes that come after that can also be run through pretty quickly, as the changes for them are not as dramatic or sweeping as what we've seen so far. Now, as the years went on, eventually Codex Witch Hunters was not really enough to keep pace with the current edition of the game, so PDFs were added to the website to keep Sisters of Battle as a playable force. However, these PDFs weren't anything more than maintenance. They weren't doing anything or adding anything particularly new, and on the whole, the army was pretty uncompetitive through the vast majority of this period. On top of that, the metal models that made up the majority of the Sisters of Battle range were increasingly moved to Finecast, making them incredibly expensive and of pretty low quality. So on the whole, not only was the army pretty outdated and difficult to play, they were also very expensive and honestly not very good looking at this point either. Undoubtedly, part of the reason why Sisters of Battle went so long without a codex was that Games Workshop were not confident with their ability in making plastic models to make models as intricately detailed as Sisters of Battle in full plastics, and they really didn't want to start up an entirely new army based wholly on metal models or fine cast. So Sisters of Battle were simply stuck in this limbo as a bit of a zombie army for a while, wherein they did get the occasional exclusive release, but nothing so harrowing as a full new unit or kit. The first new kit Sisters of Battle received in a very long time, although not part of a codex, was part of the Fall of Cadia arc, in which the triumvirate of Celestine, Greyfax, and Berisalius Cawl was released. And Celestine, while she was useful in Sisters of Battle, this was the era of Imperial Soup, where you didn't necessarily have to play Sisters of Battle to use a Sisters of Battle character. So while Celestine was good and saw competitive play, the Sisters of Battle did not see play alongside her. Certainly there were some enterprising players who tried to build entire units of Seraphim out of the Gemini, however that was a bit of a losing endeavor if I'm being completely honest, and also incredibly expensive, as originally Celestine was only available with Cawl and Greyfax in the Triumvirate box, so it would have been prohibitively expensive to do a unit like that. The first sign of life from the zombie codex of Sisters of Battle actually came when 8th edition hit. When 8th edition hit, it was so different from 7th edition that much like with 3rd edition, they did an entire new series of indexes in the back of the main rulebook to get everybody at least a functioning baseline, and the Sisters of Battle index was actually pretty respectable. Granted, it was still hamstrung by the fact that the models were expensive and annoying to work with because yet again they were still all fine cast, but Celestine herself was pretty good, and the Acts of Faith system in the index was fairly bonkers. At the start of your turn, you could roll a die for any unit, and on a 2+, they could perform an Act of Faith. The Act of Faith could be either to shoot as though it were the shooting phase, move as though it were the movement phase, or fight as though it were the fight phase. And Celestine herself just gave you a free Act of Faith you didn't even have to roll for to any unit within 6 of her. So you basically got 2 extra shooting phases at the start of your turn, or movement, or fighting, whatever you needed. It was a pretty busted system that was only held back by the fact that you had to be Adeptus Sororitas to use it, and Sisters of Battle were not in a very good shape at that point. With that being said, the release of 8th edition didn't immediately mean the release of a new Sisters of Battle codex, and as other armies started to get their codexes for 8th edition, Sisters of Battle did get a small PDF update to at least give them some basic stuff like army-specific stratagems that they had been missing in the index. This did keep them by for a little bit until the first new codex finally dropped after 17 years. And now we pan the camera over to the first printed Codex Adeptus Sororitas, the 2019 Adeptus Sororitas Codex. Now, as some trivia for people that may be newer to 40k, when this codex originally dropped, there was a bit of an issue with the release schedule for the models, and it actually took almost a year for all of the models to fully release for this particular book. So the release on the whole was kind of a mess, but it was actually a much needed breath of fresh air into an army that had otherwise been on life support. With all that being said, I do feel the need to emphasize that Adeptus Sororitas 2019 Codex was mostly about updating the model line and didn't provide a ton of new units. It did add a decent number of new characters, but 8th edition was kind of the era where you actually needed a bunch of new characters, so it was essential to essentially just run a codex at that point. Fortunately for the 2019 Adeptus Sororitas Codex, Codex Witch Hunter had already paved the way for the army to get by with a fairly minimal number of actual sculpts, and this allowed for basically half of the Sisters of Battle model line to be made from essentially 2 boxes, a Battle Sister box and a Retributor box. So this did allow for at least some time saving on Games Workshop part, but ultimately this codex was much more about updating the model line than it was necessarily getting anything new out the door. And this is part of the reason why Sisters of Battle, despite being one of the older armies in Warhammer 40k, feels like it's only about 10 years old instead of almost 30, because ultimately you had a 17-year gap in which you got essentially no new models, and then even once you got new models, it was mostly just a refresh of the existing models. It wasn't a bunch of new units to go along with them. Or to put that in simpler terms, while there are 17 years worth of time between Codex Witch Hunters and Codex Adeptus Sororitas, there are definitely not 17 years worth of models between Codex Witch Hunters and Codex Adeptus Sororitas. With with all of that out of the way, one of the biggest new features of the new Codex Adeptus Sororitas was the Miracle Dice feature, the brand new Act of Faith system, and this is actually pretty similar to the current Acts of Faith system in 10th edition. You acquire Miracle Dice at certain intervals. Once you acquire them, you roll the die, you have that value, and then at any point you can substitute that value for another die before you roll the die. You can only use a certain number of Acts of Faith per turn, yada yada, you get the drill. In the original iteration, you actually got a miracle die every time you destroyed an enemy unit. However, this was too powerful. And this also raises one of the issues with miracle dice, is that miracle dice as a mechanic have had to constantly be nerfed basically throughout their entire life cycle. It turns out the ability to just guarantee whatever result you want is incredibly good, and if you are in a particularly favorable matchup, is incredibly oppressive, because it provides a degree of insurance against the worst possible outcome. So if the worst possible outcome can't happen and you're in a favorable matchup, guess what? You're probably going to win. In this respect, I would say Miracle Dice, in my opinion, is a bit of a failed mechanic. It is incredibly difficult to design an army around, as if the army ever gets quote-unquote too good, now you're in a position where the Miracle Dice will simply guarantee a lot of wins because you can't fail these key dice rolls. Additionally, another problem with Miracle Dice is because you have to roll them in order to get the result. They also have an intrinsic element of randomness to them, so you may or may not even be able to use Miracle Dice. And anytime you're not using Miracle Dice, you effectively do not have an army-wide special rule. It's really the kind of mechanic that walks a fine line between being engaging and being oppressive, and often fails to do either. If the ability is always on, it will feel very bad for the person on the receiving end, but if you're not getting the right Miracle Dice you need for the right situation, it will feel like your army just doesn't do anything. Now, in the original version of Miracle Dice in 8th edition, you actually needed to roll low for morale checks, so low Miracle Dice actually had an intrinsic value. A 1 on a Miracle Dice could simply be used to auto-pass any morale check, which was incredibly powerful. In the current edition, you can't really use low Miracle Dice for any specific role. However, you can use Miracle Dice for certain abilities that require you to sacrifice them, which I guess is supposed to be the consolation prize for getting low Miracle Dice, but this also creates another intrinsic problem, because if you're sacrificing Miracle Dice to use abilities, what if all of your Miracle Dice are good, or what if you're not getting that many of them? It does create a bit of an issue in that you need an economy for both generating Miracle Dice but also spending Miracle Dice, but you also have the random element of how useful any given Miracle Dice will actually be on a given roll. So on the whole, while I do feel the system is powerful, it has also really struggled throughout its entire life cycle to be engaging to play against without being oppressive. While I could run through the entire list of units in Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2019, it would be pretty uninteresting for you and me, as on the whole they are basically just the units from Codex Witch Hunters updated into 8th edition, and that's really about it for the vast majority of them. So what I'm really going to be doing is hitting the high points of units that break the mold, or units that are new to this codex. The only two major non-character units that were added to Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2019 were actually the Mortifiers, because that was just an expansion of the Penitent Engine plastic kit, and the Zephyrum, because that was just an expansion of the Seraphim plastic kit. This is what I mean when I say this is mostly just updating the model range and not so much updating the unit range, because all you're really getting is units that are expanded off of other plastic kits that were already going to be available. Now, Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2019 does feature the very first appearance of Junith and her flying flamethrower pulpit, which is a pretty neat addition. The problem is 8th edition is very keyword heavy in terms of how it locks your army, so if you're not playing Order of Our Martyred Lady, you're not playing this character. In fact, order keywords in general, regardless of which order you're with, are actually pretty important to things like stratagems and abilities, so yet again you end up with Sisters of Battle that are somewhat xenophobic to their own codex in certain areas, much like with Codex Witch Hunters, in that you really want your whole army to be of the same order. Of course, this does mark the first appearance of one of honestly the best models ever released for Sisters of Battle in terms of overall flavor and aesthetic, the Triumph of St. Catherine. The Black Parade is honestly probably one of the best looking models ever released for Sisters of Battle. It is incredibly cool to look at, but it's never really been that useful on the tabletop even when it was originally released. It is a hilarious model, it is an awesome model, but it has never been a particularly good model. The 2019 Codex Adeptus Sororitas does hold another interesting distinction in that this is the first time that having a specific order actually mattered for rules. It had things like warlord traits, army abilities, and stratagems that were specific to the different orders, and this was a cool feature, although at this point in the game it has been essentially removed. And ultimately, that is really all there is to say about the Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2019. You would think after a 17-year hiatus, it would be a much bigger deal, but part of the reason why the Codex lost so much momentum was the fairly botched release schedule, but it also didn't add a ton of new units, and the army already had an index from 8th edition that had updated rules for existing units. So the transition from the 8th edition index and the PDF adding some additional rules for Sisters of Battle into the 2019 Codex Adeptus Sororitas was generally pretty smooth and honestly not as remarkable as you might think. It would really come down to another codex coming up later to add new units to change the paradigm of what it is to play Sisters of Battle. And now we move on to one of the more relevant modern codexes, Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2021. Yes, the codex naming is going to get a little tedious from here on out because from here on out they're all named Adeptus Sororitas, so bear with me on that one. One of the biggest additions to Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2021 was Morvenn Vahl and the Paragon Warsuits, and having a unit that is somewhat durable to being attacked and can also shoot and fight pretty reliably, and additionally Morvenn Vahl herself, who is a bit of a powerhouse especially in this particular codex, does fundamentally change some aspects of the paradigm in which Sisters of Battle can play. Indeed, the Paragon Warsuits and Morvenn Vahl are pretty much a staple in a lot of Sisters of Battle lists to this day. And I would also say in general that adding a unit of Sisters of Battle walkers that all have melee and range weapons does somewhat change the idea of what a Sisters of Battle unit can theoretically be. Previously, Sisters of Battle units have either been vehicles or people on foot with guns with very little distinction in between. Adding something like a walker unit that can both fight and shoot at the same time, and especially a character that is effectively a big monster, is actually a pretty significant departure from what we've seen in the past. Another unit that marked a pretty significant departure from what we've seen in the past for Sisters of Battle, and that also enhanced what the Sisters of Battle could be and could do, were the Celestine Sacrosancts. This was the first melee unit for Sisters of Battle that the Codex had ever seen that could actually take a hit in return with a decent armor save and a decent invulnerable save to boot, while not being complete pushovers in melee. Now, as I said earlier, the reason they have the name Celestine Sacrosancts instead of just being called Celestines is because the Bolter Celestines are still present in the 2021 Codex. And the last major unit that really keeps the train rolling and changes the paradigm to some extent about what a Sisters of Battle unit can be is the Castigator main battle tank. The Castigator, with its dual autocannons and 3 heavy bolters, provides a pretty impressive amount of firepower that was previously available on basically nothing else in the army outside of maybe an Exorcist. But of course, the Exorcists have always taken a random number of shots, so having a vehicle that was just a reliable base of fire that could also take some punishment is really just another aspect of the paradigm of Sisters of Battle being fleshed out that hasn't really been seen before. On top of that, the Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2021 keeps things like Sacred Rites, the Orders, and it also keeps a lot of the other units that you had from previous codexes. So this is probably the most well-rounded and fleshed out Sisters of Battle have ever been in their entire existence, and it is a pretty robust army list. This does bring us around to a small annotation before we wrap up with the last Sisters of Battle Codex released so far, and that is the Warzone Nachtmung Vigilus Alone book. This book actually had rules for the Order of the Bloody Rose. They weren't exactly a full-on codex, but they were supplements with things like warlord traits, relics, and some order-specific stratagems. This means the Bloody Rose is currently the only order of Sisters of Battle that have had their own set of rules separate from the main rulebook so far. And I do have to say that picking the Order of the Bloody Rose was a great choice by Games Workshop, if I do say so myself. And that brings us all the way up to the current Sisters of Battle Codex, Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2024. I told you the names were going to get tedious. With that being said, after the fairly impressive showing of Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2021, 2024 was less than impressive. The only notable unit really added was the Canoness with Jump Pack, and while it is certainly a cool model, it does not change the paradigm, in particular for the army as a whole. To boot, the total number of units going from Codex 2021 to Codex 2024 actually goes down somewhat noticeably. That being said, most of the units that were lost weren't really that big of a deal. You're mostly just losing things like the Celestines with bolters, which nobody really played, the Crusaders, the Death Cult Assassins, and the option to include missionaries, and also kind of the Battle Sanctum, the basically giant church that you could take as a terrain feature, because moving into 10th, Games Workshop got away from buying terrain features for a lot of armies, but anyway. Mostly all this is doing is updating the existing models for 10th edition, which the detachment system, and the detachment system actually does away with all of the order special rules that we had previously had. So while there was a brief heyday of a few years in which the specific order you were playing mattered, we're back around to it not really being a big deal again, and yet again, sacred rights are also out the door. On the whole, I think it's hard to argue that this is a bit of a downgrade in terms of unit variety and also to a lesser extent army build variety going from 2021 to 2024, especially because you also lose the Demi Codex that you had for the Order of the Bloody Rose from the Vigilus Alone book. On the whole, I would say there is very little to say about Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2024 that hasn't already been said elsewhere. It is basically just the previous codexes but with less options yet again, and considering that Sororitas were already limited on options because of a 17-year hiatus in which they received no real new models, it actually is kind of annoying to get an entire codex that basically does nothing but add a single character with a jump pack. All of that is not to say that the Codex Adeptus Sororitas 2024 is not playable by any means. You can certainly play it, you can win games with it, you can have success with it, but it's pretty undeniably a lot less interesting than the previous codex. So at this point, let's start wrapping around to some general conclusions. What are the issues that Sisters of Battle as an army have faced throughout their existence? The biggest one is actually just model selection. Having a range of metal models that Games Workshop essentially just decided to stop supporting didn't exactly do them any favors in terms of getting new models released at all, and additionally the fact that Sisters of Battle and their general designs didn't really play well with existing plastic technology for a very long time did definitely delay their ability to get anything new or interesting added to their overall lineup. This resulted in an army that feels less like it's from the dawn of 40k and more like it's from about 5 to 10 years ago. Another issue in my mind has actually been the Acts of Faith system. The more I go back and look at all of the old iterations of Acts of Faith, the more I'm convinced Games Workshop doesn't really know what this ability is supposed to be or supposed to do. In the earliest iteration, it did things that were basically impossible and crazy, and even in the later iteration that you got in the Index allowed them to do things that were exceptional and not normal, but when you get into the Miracle Die system, now they're just guaranteeing that an otherwise normal thing happens, and I'm not really sure that's that much of a miracle or an act of faith. Honestly, the system just feels like it probably needs some review by Games Workshop because I don't think they have a clear vision as to what they want it to do or even what it's supposed to be representing in universe. I would also broadly say that going back to the earliest days of Sisters of Battle, Games Workshop seems very unclear as to whether this army is supposed to be elite or cannon fodder, and the point costs and stats have always stood somewhere in between the two. This makes for models that are often awkwardly costed as they don't quite have the stats to justify a high point cost, but they aren't cheap enough to justify being run in large numbers either. I would also say that the main reason why Sisters of Battle lost their toughness 4 going into 3rd edition was because Games Workshop was on a bit of a kick at the time where they wanted Space Marine stats to be special. So if you wanted the stats of a Space Marine, which were 4s across the board, you had to be exceptional, and that's part of the reason why Orcs were only at strength 3 for the longest time. However, the idea that a Space Marine stats are inherently special has just been so thoroughly eviscerated that I don't see a compelling reason why Sisters of Battle couldn't get toughness 4, even if they don't necessarily get strength 4. That's not to say I necessarily think they should or that it would really solve anything, but it does seem like the toughness 4 was kind of removed from them for what is essentially an erroneous reason looking back on it. I would also say that the Holy Trinity, while being codified, did make the army interesting and gave it a nice bit of flavor, also locked them into a somewhat awkward range of weapons that only really work at closer ranges, and close range shooting when your army doesn't fight particularly well and a lot of your models aren't super durable is not really the best combination. Unless those weapons have a really high impact, it's a high risk, high reward kind of scenario, and even if they do have high impact, you're still taking a significant risk of one bad round of dice rolling, meaning your unit doesn't do enough work to really justify the investment. What this basically means is that Sisters of Battle, more so than basically any other army, is heavily reliant on these 3 specific weapons being actually useful in the current meta, and quite often they just haven't been. Bolters Flamers are a very spammy weapon, Flamers are very situational. The Meltas have had their time in the Shun, but they've also had their times when they've been kind of underwhelming. In the last few codexes, Games Workshop have made moves to correct this by giving things like the Ministorum Flamers that have higher stats than a normal Flamers, but honestly I think they should just carry that to its natural fruition and make Ministorum Flamers and Blessed Bolters and Consecrated Meltas and just give them whatever stats the weapon needs to have to do the job without having to worry about accidentally giving Space Marines or Imperial Guard something that's overpowered. I really feel like they should just completely decouple these Sisters of Battle weapons from the other weapons used by other armies of the Imperium, because while these weapons are a nice extra for armies like Space Marines and Imperial Guard, they are absolutely essential to work for an army like Sisters of Battle. Ultimately, what I feel like a lot of this just boils down to is the Games Workshop design team that is looking at Sisters of Battle needs to basically pick a lane in several key areas and stick with it, and also build it up to the point where it can support a fully functioning army on its own. Because as it stands right now, I don't always get the impression that that's the case, and they seem to be a lot more erratic about how they feel about certain aspects of Sisters of Battle from codex to codex. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. I would love to know what anybody who is still watching this point thinks in the comments down below. Feel free to let me know. I always love hearing from you guys, and especially given how long this video has been, a special thank you to anybody that is still watching up to this point. If you like the video this much, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. When I do put out content, you will be the first to get notified. As always, danke bitte tschüss.